This was around 2017 in spring or fall. I was 19 at the time and I live in Germany. Me and my friends used to hang out at a friend's basement, just messing around, playing video games, or watching movies until late at night. My best friend at the time lived just a couple houses down the street from where I lived, and usually it was just the two of us riding our bikes back home. There were two routes we used to get home, one through the city, or the other significantly shorter one through a small forest which was maybe about 1 kilometer or 2/3 of a mile. The forest route was completely dark and led to an unlit highway via bridge. We only took that route when we were equipped with lights and in a group of at least 2 people, because there were a lot of boars, and you don't want to be on your own in case something happens. So one night, we set out to ride home. As we got close to the bridge, my friend who was leading the way suddenly brakes because there was a relatively large tree laying across the trail. We both took our bikes and lifted them over the tree and continued. Maybe 10 to 20 meters later, we suddenly spot a fire where we had to make our turn. It was about the size of a small campfire. We both got a little slower as we saw the fire, and then when getting closer, we spotted 6 or 7 people around the fire forming a semicircle, all facing us. They were all wearing long white dresses or gowns with masks. Not Klansman masks, but more akin to sailors' hats with veils. A couple of seconds went by. We were just staring at them as they were staring at us. Then one of them began moving towards us, and we pedaled as fast as we could towards the bridge. I don't know who they were or what they were doing, but we didn't stop until we were on a well-lit road again. Yesterday, while returning home from work, I was exhausted and I decided to sit down on a bench at a small park. The park was empty at the time. About 5 minutes later, a young man, I'd say he was in his late 20s to early 30s, dressed in a business suit, holding a briefcase, sat on the bench across me and started to occasionally stare at me. Later on, he got up and sat next to me on the bench and said, "How are you, Jennifer?" This was in the US and he had a British accent. He was also speaking in a very exaggerated manner, like theatrical. I was surprised and thought this was someone from my college or high school that I didn't recognize at the time, and when I asked how he knew my name, he simply replied, "Oh, it doesn't matter." I then put his briefcase to his lap and folded his hands on top of the briefcase. At this point, I started to feel worried and asked him again how he knew me, but before I could finish my sentence, he interrupted me and said, "I'll get to that in a little while, but first, let me ask you, are you satisfied with where you are living right now?" He then proceeded to announce exactly where I lived. He then said, "What are your thoughts on your workplace? Are you satisfied with your wage?" And then he correctly stated my wage. At this point, I started to get really creeped out by him and asked him who he was again, and he calmly replied, "It does not matter at this moment. Right now, what matters is that I want to help you." He then went on to state a lot of personal information about me that I would think no one would ever know, and he especially knew a lot about my personal relationships. As he was saying all this, I began gathering my things and got up from the bench. With shakiness in my voice, I asked who he was and what he wanted. He didn't answer me and told me to calm down. I then began yelling at him, and he still didn't say anything. All he did was this very weird thing where he rolled his eyes and then slowly looked back as if someone was standing behind him and just said, "Very well then." The way he did it was strange, almost as if he were a character giving the camera a side eye and breaking the fourth wall. He picked up his briefcase, got up from the bench, and started to approach me. I tried to reach for the pepper spray in my bag, but he grabbed my arm and said, "No need for that," pushed me away, and I lost my balance and fell to the ground. He then quickly walked away. I just stayed there on the ground for a minute, not knowing what to do, thinking about how he knew so much about me, and I knew next to nothing about him. When I got back up, I tried looking for him, but I didn't see him and decided to get out of there. I later reported this incident to the police, and I am now staying somewhere else. I am never exploring ever again. I lived in the middle of nowhere in Canada. It was an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to lack of residents. Me and my friends were tired of the same boring entertainment options for us, so what we did was explore these abandoned buildings. When I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part mental hospital. Weird combination, I know. It closed down due to a lack of patients and lack of children at the daycare. I decided to go back there with my friends a few years ago. I was 15 when this happened. When we did get there, it was rather cliche. There was fog, it was dark, and there was a light drizzle of rain. We went to the main gate, which was padlocked shut. When we decided to help each other hop over it, it made a ton of noise. We were laughing and giggling the whole time, unsuspecting of what was to come. We looked around the small playground with flashlights we had. Even with our somewhat powerful flashlights, our visibility was still rather limited. We decided to enter the decaying building. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos, wood chips from previous furniture, old torn dolls, and toys strewn about. The further we walked around the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent until all we could hear was a crunch of the dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to pick them up, when all of a sudden, we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door. This door led to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I all looked at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of them were very bold and cocky. We all looked at each other when my friend Brian suggested we go and look to see where the sound came from. Personally, I wasn't too fond of this idea, but with my group of friends, there was no way anyone was going to decline such a thing. We all stacked up on the door and opened it. It was rusted to the floor and we heaved to get it open. As we walked in, the metallic smells and must became stronger, with a hint of something else which I couldn't quite put my finger on at that moment. We walked in, our flashlights pointed in every direction with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight, and to the left and right were the occasional metal doorway, some with doors open. I felt slightly claustrophobic and it felt a little hard to breathe. As we continued, Ryan shined his light into a room and recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered the room. "What is it?" I asked him. "I thought I saw someone in here. It seems all fine now." To be honest, I thought he was just messing with us to increase our anxiety. But looking back, I think he was being completely honest. He backed out of the room and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward when another friend swiftly told us to stop. We came to a halt and all listened. In the distance ahead of us, we heard the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echo throughout the hallway. We all looked at each other, fear in each of our eyes. Brian continued walking towards the sounds. We considered turning back for a second without Brian, wondering if some ghost or something was in the building, but we couldn't do that to him. The closer we got, the more I felt like I was being watched, when finally, we entered a room on the right which had the smell of rotting meat. In front of us was a dead deer. Its innards were spilled all over the floor, staining the concrete. A friend of mine had a very weak stomach and vomited all over the floor. That's when we heard whispering from somewhere. Brian shined his flashlight to the corner of the room where a man with short hair was standing with his head down. He wore a bright green t-shirt stained with what I assume was blood and torn beige pants. He didn't have any socks and his feet seemed damaged. He was twitching sporadically and continued to mumble even after we saw him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first true movement. He looked up at us with a haunting grin that sent shivers down our spine. "You guys here for the feast?" He said each word with varying inflection and energy. This kicked us over the edge and we bolted out of that room all the way back to the daycare center. The door was still open and we decided to try and slam it shut, but the rust and pure weight of the door almost kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all of our strength to close it, and just before we did, I could still see the silhouette of the man watching us, his teeth being the only other human feature I could see. As we sat behind the metal door, catching our breath for a second, all looking at each other for confirmation that we all saw the same thing. After a little bit of labored breathing from each of us, we heard a light tapping on the door. That's when we decided that it was time to leave. We booked it out of there and ran home. A year after we visited that spot, police went back to do a routine search of the area and found the man. It was stated that this guy used to go to the psych ward before it closed down. He escaped the facility he was transferred to and lived off the wildlife around the complex. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases and sickness from eating raw meat. His mental condition was much worse than before. There were future rumors that he did kill someone in the forest while searching for food, but nothing has been confirmed.